Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Monica Sakhrani and now we are doing the fifth and last module of criminal law. Here we will look at trial of criminal cases. So the first preliminary issue that we will look at is jurisdiction. We have already done this in the previous module where we looked at territorial jurisdiction, that every police station is attached to a particular court. So only that court will, so here we are looking at the court processes. So only the court which has the jurisdiction over a particular police station will actually try the case. And the charge sheet is filed over there, the accused is produced before that particular magistrate, the charge sheet, so the case, after the charge sheet is filed, the trial of the case will begin. Now there's another level of jurisdiction which is subject matter. As we spoke about in the first module of criminal law, the CRPC has a first schedule in which there are a list of offences, those which are triable by Sessions Court and those which are triable by Magistrates Court. So these are the basic two courts which try offences. Now suppose it's a case which is triable by the Sessions Court. So the charge sheet, the accused will still be produced before the magistrate and the charge sheet will still be filed before the magistrate before whom the jurisdiction is, even in a murder case, in a rape case, which are Sessions triable. And once the charge sheet is filed, then the court magistrate will transfer the case to the Sessions Court. So basically once the charge sheet is filed, the court will give a case number to the case. Till then it is what is known as a CR number, which is the FIR. So the FIR has a crime register number, CR number. So till then the case will have a CR number. Once the charge sheet is filed, the case will get a case number. So if it's a police case, it's a private complaint. So all those are given a number, and then if the magistrate transfers the case to the Sessions Court, which is known as committal proceedings, then the Sessions Court will give a third number to the case. So one particular case can have as many as 3 numbers. Now under certain special laws like UAPA, NDPS and other laws like POCSO, there are special courts which are assigned to hear these cases. Now generally a Sessions Court is designated as a special court and the matter goes before that. The difference between a special court and a regular Sessions Court trial is that in this particular case, in a special court case, the remand, the FIR, the charge sheet, everything is filed before the special court. There is no committal proceedings over here. So that is the basic difference between the two. Now in civil law, there is a concept called limitation, which is that you can't sleep over your rights. You have to file a case within a particular time limit. So there are different time limits given for different categories of cases. In criminal law, generally because of the seriousness of the offence and the public nature of the case, generally for offences which are punishable with more than 3 years, there is no time limit. It can be filed whenever you get the information. So suppose somebody discovers 20 years later that someone X was murdered. What seemed like a body, a very filmy situation, a body is found, decayed body is found in somebody's cupboard. So you discover that an offence had taken place, somebody was murdered. So do you say that, oh, this was done like 5 years back, 10 years back, and therefore no case will be registered? No, the case will still be registered, because if it is more than 3 years of case, and how can somebody be allowed to get away with murder just because the person was successful in hiding the crime from everyone for so long? So, but in other cases which are less punishable with less than 3 years, there is a limitation period. So for an offence punishable with only fine, 6 months is the limitation period. For an offence punishable with 1 year or less, the limitation is 1 year. And for an offence punishable between 1 year and 3 years, the period is 3 years. So you have to file the case within 3 years. And this is after knowing about the commission of the offence. Now, once the charge sheet is filed and the matter has come up before the court, the first step that the court takes is what one calls framing of charge. Now, the court will go through the charge sheet and find out these are the accused before it, what is the evidence against the accused as per the charge sheet, what is disclosed in the charge sheet against the accused, and on the basis of that, what are the sections that the police have put. So the charge will be that you are accused of, you are charged with the offence of committing rape, committing murder of so and so on such and such a day, and the court will ask, do you plead guilty or not? So if the accused says, yes, I plead guilty, then there is no trial of the case will be closed, and then the court will sentence the accused, and the accused will be sentenced. This accused, if he pleads guilty, if he wants to file an appeal, he can only file an appeal with regards to the sentence. So I can say, it was such a minor offense and he's given me 5 years. I pleaded guilty thinking I'll get 6 months. So I can ask for less sentence, but I can't say that, oh, I wouldn't have pleaded guilty, I'm actually innocent. I can't say that, because once I plead guilty, I've pleaded guilty. So as social workers, if we are talking about rights of the accused, we have to advise people who are involved in cases that they have a right to fair trial, they have a right to legal aid. Just because you cannot afford a lawyer does not mean you must plead guilty. You have many poor people, we find, plead guilty without knowing the repercussions of that. But as social workers, we should be aware of the repercussions of that. What happens is that then the person, in case of a next case where the person is arrested, then bail will become more difficult, because you have a previous criminal history. You have what is known as criminal antecedents. So all these will become, then you will be called a recidivist. So you will not get probation. You have the right to be released on Probation of Offenders Act if you have convicted for the first time. But if you have already been convicted, then the second time you will not be able to get the benefit of Probation of Offenders Act. So, and if we want to basically see that people are not hurtled into a life of crime, then we must see that they get a fair trial, because many innocent people then get hardened and get into, feel that they have no options. So, if the accused does not plead guilty, then he stands trial. Now, suppose the charge sheet does not disclose any role of the accused in the commission of an offence. So, then the accused will file what is known as a discharge application before the court. And the court will then hear the discharge application. If there is no evidence disclosed in the charge sheet, then the accused will get a discharge. But what cannot be done in a discharge application is, I say, but I have an alibi, I have defense witnesses who will say this, I have evidence which will show this. In India, we have what is known as an adversarial system of trial, criminal trial. So my right to silence means that I don't participate in the investigation process at all, and my turn to speak will come only after the prosecution either fails to prove its case or proves its case. So only after the prosecution proves its case beyond reasonable doubt, then my evidence will be taken, and then I will produce my evidence to show that. So suppose I have documentary proof to show that I was not even at the place at the time of the offence. So a murder has taken place or a theft has taken place and I was somewhere else. I have witnesses to show that I have a train ticket to show I was not there. Then also I have to produce it only at the time of trial. I cannot produce it at the time of the discharge application. So the discharge has to be done on the basis of the charge sheet only. So once the charge is framed, the trial will begin. Now suppose as a accused, I have not pleaded guilty, but I still have an option of plea bargaining. Now what is plea bargaining? Generally, in a plea bargaining case, I have a settlement with the victim. So even if it is a non-compoundable case, and I can still tell the court that I am ready to plead guilty and settle the matter. Now in this particular case, and this will be applicable only in cases which are punishable with 7 years of imprisonment or less, and which are not which do not affect the socio-economic condition of the country, or have been committed against a woman or a child below 14 years. So there are certain categories of offences which may be punishable with less than 7 years, but they are still exempt from plea bargaining. Now suppose my case comes under a plea bargaining provision, and I want to plea bargain, I don't want to stand trial, I feel I've done something and I want to make amends for that. So I make an application. The court will then send the copy of the application, will first find out whether I've done it voluntarily or whether I've been pressurized into doing it. Now suppose I've done it voluntarily, then the court will send the copy to the complainant, the victim and the prosecutor. And then the parties will sit down together and work out a mutually agreeable settlement, which may include giving the victim some kind of compensation and other expenses. Now once the matter is settled, then that the settlement is shown to the court, and the court can then sentence the accused to 1/4 of the punishment that is the maximum punishment. If there is a minimum sentence for that particular offense, then half the minimum sentence. So this is, the court has the discretion to either do that or release the accused on probation. Probation is on good conduct. So there will be a probation officer who will, will monitor your behavior. And then if they feel that so suppose you have been sentenced to 2 years of imprisonment, that is the 1/4 of the sentence, or 1 year or 6 months of imprisonment, and they will put you on probation, and the probation officer will see you for 6 months. If after 3 months he gives an adverse report, then you go to jail for 3 months, the remaining of the 6 months. And if for 6 months your conduct is okay, then you will be cleared of the case. It will be as if you've served your sentence. So that is what probation is. So if suppose there's no plea bargaining, and plea bargaining has come in recently, but suppose there's no plea bargaining, then the trial will begin. Now generally there are a trial in the magistrates court and the trial in the family court, trial in the sessions court are slightly different. But even in the magistrates court, the trial in a private complaint is different from trial in a police case. The trial in a police case and the trial in the sessions court are very similar. Where the police has filed a charge sheet, the trial is very similar in both the sessions court as well as the magistrates court. In a private complaint, the trial is a bit different. There are some cases which are summary trial cases where only a gist of the complaint is written, like traffic offences and all that, where such an elaborate procedure is not followed. Summons cases are basic. Summary trial cases are generally, there's a list of cases which are given, which are not very serious. Then there is a summons triable case which are punishable with 2 years or less, and the others are warrant triable cases which are punishable with more than 2 years. So the trial of these cases is a bit different, but what we will be focusing on is, but basically the steps may be a little different, but may follow a bit differently, but all these steps have to be followed in all trials. So what we will be looking at is basically how a trial in a police case or a sessions tribal case is actually committed. So if you have a private complaint, the steps may differ a little, but more or less the same steps have to be followed. So once the trial begins, the first step is that because the burden of proof is on the prosecution has to produce its evidence. So generally, if there is a document also, it has to be proved through a witness. So all the witnesses have to come and orally depose in court. This is known as oral evidence. So in the oral evidence, there are 3 stages of oral evidence. So when the person comes and gives evidence, that is known as examination in chief. So a witness has come to the court and is deposing about what that person has seen, or what that person has heard, or what that person has experienced. So you can only give an evidence about an event in which you are directly connected, and not something that you've heard about. So that is known as hearsay evidence. Hearsay evidence is, I heard so and so tell me that X has done it, and I'm coming to court, so and so is not coming to court, I'm coming to court. That evidence is inadmissible in India, except when it comes to dying declarations. I have made a statement to the police or to the doctor, or to I'm a woman who's been burnt and I've landed up in the hospital, and there the doctor comes and examines me, and I say my husband burnt me, and then I die. So that is a dying declaration. The doctor can come and say that the person has told me that the person died. Or if suppose like I give a complaint to the police that I fear for my life and I feel that so and so is going to attack me, I give a letter to the police, and then I die. So the fact that I fear that X may try to kill me becomes relevant in my death case, in my murder case. So then that dying declaration is the only evidence where the witness does not come to depose about something that they have personally experienced, because of course the witness is dead. But in other cases, the witness has to come and speak about whatever they have seen, heard, or experienced. Now in the examination in chief, I state the facts. Now there is no leading question allowed in an examination in chief. What is a leading question? A leading question is one which has the answer in it. So for example, if a witness comes in the box, the prosecution can't ask him, did you on such and such a day see X kill Y? Because that is a leading question. That is yes, the answer will be yes or no, because the answer is in the question. So the prosecution has to ask me, what happened on such and such a day? Then I will give the evidence. And generally I have to stick to what are known as relevant facts and facts and issues. So if it's a murder case, I have to talk about that. Or is a relevant fact is, suppose was there an enmity between X and Y? Did X have a reason to kill Y? So then that becomes a relevant fact in a murder case of Y. So then that I can give evidence about. I was a witness to a fight where somebody threatened to kill somebody. So then that becomes a relevant fact, even though I did not see that person kill that person. So that is what I give my evidence about. So that is examination in chief. After that, the accused, through his lawyer, can ask questions to the witness, and that is known as cross-examination. Now, in the cross-examination, any question that is relevant to the case can be asked. In rape trials, the witness cannot be, the prosecutrix cannot be asked questions which impeach her or which touch upon her past sexual history. But I can ask a witness that, are you friends with the accused? Are you enemies with the accused? What was your relationship like? In order to discredit the witness, I can generally ask the witness certain questions to show that the person is lying in the court. So I can ask certain questions, but they should be relevant to the trial of the case. They should be relevant to the issues before the court. So this is the oral evidence. Now in oral evidence, again, there is substantive evidence and corroborative evidence. Substantive evidence where actually I'm an eyewitness to a particular fact and issue, that did X murder Y. But corroborative evidence would be that I saw them fight, that I saw X, lurking in that place at night. I saw him running with a knife, blood-soaked knife. I saw him, I found him hiding something in a particular place. So I am a shopkeeper and somebody has come with stolen property to sell it to me. Then that becomes relevant, that how did that person get the property that belonged to somebody else. So those are corroborative evidences, and that also I can give evidence about. So that is equally important. Another way of dividing the evidence is direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is to the point. Circumstantial evidence is in a case where no eyewitness is there, then the court will look at circumstances to decide whether the accused has committed the offense. A direct evidence is where somebody is speaking, saying that I saw this happen. So, but in all cases it's not that simple. So does that mean that in those cases there can be no conviction? No, there can be conviction, but we will look at circumstantial evidence in a little while. Now another thing that is important is that how many witnesses should be there in a case. Now there need not be an X number of witnesses in a particular case. One witness is sufficient to prove a case, provided the court believes that this witness is speaking the truth, and I can believe beyond reasonable doubt that the accused has committed the offense. Then yes, the court can convict, because there may be cases like in a rape case, there may be no other witnesses except the prosecutrix, because rapes don't get committed in public places in front of everybody, very rarely. So in many cases there may be no eyewitnesses apart from the victim themselves, and if the court believes that yes, this eyewitness is completely trustworthy, and I'm somebody who saw somebody being murdered, so I have nothing to do with the case, I don't know anyone, I have no interest in implicating the accused in that particular case, and the court believes that whatever I'm saying is the truth, then yes, the court can convict only on the basis of sole evidence of that one person. Now generally, who can be a witness? Anyone can be a witness except those prevented from understanding the questions put to them, or from giving rational answers to those questions by tender years, extreme old age, disease, whether of body or mind, or any other cause of the same kind. Now here the question comes that if a person is suffering from a certain disability, then if the person is still able to speak through a translator, also through a special educator, that person can give evidence. So there is no such embargo against people with disability giving evidence. The issue that generally comes up is with regards to children. Now generally the rule is that if there is only a child witness to the account, if there is a child witness, then that child witness statement should be corroborated on material particulars by other evidence. So if suppose the child witness says that I saw X kill Y with a knife. So if has the murder taken place with a knife, does the post-mortem report disclose that? Does the is the description of the knife that he is talking about corroborated by the type of knife which was seized? His time and place, is that corroborated as per the scene of offence Panchnama, etc.? So the court will look at whether there is corroboration on the material particulars that the person is speaking about. But generally child witness, they take it a little more carefully, because a child witness can be what is called tutored. So there is this whole concept of tutored witnesses, and so the child witness should not be tutored. That is the because the child is amenable to influence. So therefore the child witnesses statements are generally taken into account with care. Now the types of witnesses in various judgments have been categorized. This is not there in the law of evidence, in the Evidence Act, but it's been categorized differently in various judgments of the court. So one is the independent witness, which we spoke about, the Panchnama, the Pancha. I don't know the accused, I don't know the victim, I'm an eyewitness to this case. So something has happened, so I'm speaking about that. So that is an independent witness. An interested witness is someone who's interested in the case, and therefore might be interested in seeing that the accused is convicted in the case. So in those cases, the interested witnesses' statements are generally have to be corroborated and have to be looked at with care. Now, one of the principles of interested witnesses started becoming applicable in rape cases. So the court started looking at the rape victim's statement as a statement of an interested person and started looking for corroboration. Now, the Supreme Court in various judgments has said that the prosecutrix in the rape case is not an interested witness. Her statement should not be looked at with care and for complete corroboration on material particulars, but has to be treated on par as an independent witness, and therefore her statement has to be given a greater value than an interested witness's statement is to be given. Now there is another type of witness. This is like, suppose in a particular case the police know that an offence has taken place, they've arrested the accused, but the accused confessional statements cannot be used, or the accused are not confessing to the crime and therefore their statements cannot be used, and so the police have got no witnesses, or they feel they don't have enough evidence to get a conviction. And this is in very serious offences, like in the 1993 bomb blast case, for example. The police asked one of the accused to turn an approver, that is to turn a witness in for the prosecution and give evidence for the prosecution in return for pardon. So in certain serious cases, if the police feel that it's a very serious offence and they don't have enough evidence and therefore the accused may get an acquittal, the police can ask one of the accused to become an approver, and that approver evidence will again has to be corroborated on material particulars for the court to convict. Now the second type of evidence is documentary evidence. So all documents have to be proved by the makers of that document, and the content of any document has to be proved by the original. This is known as primary evidence. So suppose like I am the first informant, the first information report, the original first information report where I have signed, not the Xerox copy, is what will be shown to me, and I will identify that. If there is a medical report, the medical report is shown to me, the doctor, and the doctor will identify it. If there is a ballistic report, the chemical analyst or the forensic expert will be called and the report will be admitted through that. Panchnama has to be admitted through the Pancha, and the original Panchnama has to be given to the court. Now this is documentary evidence. And the second type of documentary evidence is what is called secondary evidence. This includes certified copies of a judgment. If I'm relying upon a judgment, I'm saying that there was a dispute and this house actually belongs to me, or this land actually belongs to me, or there was a court case and this was the judgment, or that I want to prove my birth date. I want to show that I'm a minor, and therefore I'm proving my birth date through a birth certificate. Now in that case, a birth certificate is a secondary evidence. It's a certified copy issued by the authority. Now in these cases, which are government documents, or I want to show that a book is defamatory or an article in a newspaper is defamatory, I cannot go and get hold of the original article which was handwritten or typed out by the journalist, but I have a newspaper copy, and that is because it is made through a process which ensures that this is what they are saying. He can't say that I actually wrote something else and there was a typo and this came out later on differently. So in those cases, mechanical, where there is an accuracy in the copy and copies are compared with these copies or from the original, then in those cases the secondary evidence can be produced. In another type of case where secondary evidence can be produced is where the witness has the original and is refusing, somebody else has the original and is refusing to produce it. The other side has the original and is refusing to produce it because it will go against them. Then in that case, I can produce a certified copy or a Xerox copy, and the other person has to prove that this is not the original. And if they don't produce, this is not what the document actually says. And if they do not produce it, then that the court will hold that they are not speaking the truth. So after looking at documentary evidence, now we will look at circumstantial evidence. Now in cases where there is no direct eyewitness account, the court will look at the circumstances of the case from which an inference of guilt can be drawn or not. Now the circumstances should be such that every circumstance points to the guilt of the accused. In various judgments, the courts have held that this is like a chain, and even if there is one link in that chain which is broken, then the chain itself breaks and no accused can be convicted on that. Now in one of the important cases on circumstantial evidence in India, there is the Sharda alias Sharad Birdhichand. In this particular case, a woman was, her husband was accused of murdering his wife. Now in this particular case, what had happened was that there was dowry demand, there was dowry harassment, and the wife was sent off to her parents' house by the husband, and from there she was sent back to the husband's house. And the husband, after 1 week, when the parents tried to contact the girl, the husband said, oh, she never came back, she went missing, and her body was never found. But in this particular case, the fact that there was harassment, there was evidence to show that the girl had actually gone to the husband's house and from there she went missing. It was held that the circumstances were such that all of them led to the guilt of the accused and not the innocence of the accused, and in that particular case, the accused was convicted of murdering his wife. So this is circumstantial evidence. Now after the now what if in a particular case the accused has confessed? Now does that mean that the confession itself will means that there will be no trial and only the confession has to be proved? No, all the witnesses have to still be brought. The confession has to be proved. If it is a confession made under section 164 of the CRPC, that is before the magistrate, then that has to, the magistrate comes and brings the original confession and proves it. And if it is made to any other person, then that person has to, what is known as an extrajudicial confession, that also has to be proved. No confession to a police officer can be proved to a court except if it leads to what is known as recovery or discovery of an article or evidence. So that can be proved against the accused, where it leads to some recovery of a murder weapon, or it leads to recovery of stolen property, then yes, that can be proved through the pancha. It has to be proved through the pancha. And if I made a confession, whether it is a judicial confession or an extrajudicial confession, then that can be retracted by the accused. A retracted confession has to be corroborated by other evidence. Similarly, if I confess saying that X and I committed an offense, then the court will can convict me on the basis of my confession against myself, but against X, it has to look for material corroboration on material particulars. It will be just one of the evidences before the court. It will not be the sole evidence before the court. Now, after the evidence is over of the prosecution, the accused statement is recorded under section 313. This is not a statement under oath. The accused is asked certain questions, that this witness came and said this about you. What do you have to say? So the witness can say, he's lying, it's not the truth, it is false, it is true, I don't know. Suppose somebody says that, I'm so-and-so's neighbor. I may say that I do not know whether the person is his neighbor or not, the victim's neighbor. So there are statements, generally, but it is not a statement on oath, it is not evidence of the accused. But the accused will be put all the circumstances. If he wants to say anything, he can say that without taking an oath. Now once the 313 statement is over, the defense evidence begins. Here if I want to examine myself as a witness, I can, but if I don't examine, and defense evidence, generally in most cases there is no stage of defense evidence. Most of the accused do not produce any evidence. You only produce evidence when the prosecution has proved its case beyond reasonable doubt, or if you want to bring your case under a general exception, I want to prove that I was mentally of unsound mind, or that it was done with consent or whatever. If I am able to bring my case into one of the general exceptions, then I bring in defense evidence. Or if I want to rebut the prosecution evidence in any other way, I want to show that there was an alibi, or the person is actually motivated and is lying, and I have eyewitnesses who will say something else. So in that case, yes, I can bring my defense evidence and I can produce. Then again, my witness will, it will be examination in chief from my side, and the prosecution will cross-examine the witness. So after this is over, then the arguments will be held. Where the defense evidence is concerned, the burden of proof is on preponderance of probabilities and not beyond reasonable doubt. Now if the court acquits, then that is the end of the story, but the prosecution and the victim, the first informant, the complainant, have the right to go on appeal against that decision. So an appeal against conviction can also be, acquittal can be filed, but the general rule is that if an appeal is filed against acquittal, and if there is the evidence shows that either view is possible, acquittal or conviction, then the court should lean towards acquittal of the accused. If there is a conviction, then the accused has a right to be heard on sentencing, and on the sentencing, circumstances other than the circumstances relating to the crime are taken into account. So it will be like my age, my occupation, my family circumstances, my relationship with the accused, with the victim, that there was a history, that I was also attacked. So all these circumstances will be taken into account before the court passes a sentence. Now the court has the right to award compensation to the victim. That can be done from part of the fine that is recovered from the accused. In rape and sexual offences, compensation, the accused can be ordered to pay compensation. Apart from that, the government also under section 357A has to pay compensation in cases of crimes to victims. So the court can order compensation to be paid. Now what are the different punishments that can be granted in India? Now the most simple punishment is fine. So fine has to be paid. If I do not pay the fine, then I will undergo simple imprisonment for a period that the court will specify. So the court may say you pay 500 rupees fine. If you don't pay that money, then you undergo sentence for 1 week. If I pay 250 rupees, then I undergo sentence for 3 days or 3.5 days, the remaining period. The other is forfeiture of property. Suppose stolen property is recovered from me, and that will be forfeited. It will not, I cannot say I went to jail for 3 years, so now the stolen property belongs to me. That will not happen. It will be, so I forfeit my property. Any ill-gotten wealth that I've got that has been seized, the government takes charge of that. The other is imprisonment. Imprisonment can be rigorous or simple. Simple imprisonment where I do not work, and rigorous imprisonment where I have to perform labor. I will be paid a minimal amount of money, which will be less than the minimum wage. So prisoners who work, who do rigorous imprisonment, are paid some amount of money. The other is imprisonment for life. Generally, it does not mean imprisonment for the rest of my life. There is a specified period for different offences, different periods are there. But now there is a trend which says that imprisonment for life, and the court can also decide that imprisonment for life means the rest of a person's life. So either the statute will specify that imprisonment for life means the rest of your life, and in certain cases the courts hold that life imprisonment means the rest of your life. And in the rarest of rare cases, death is given. Now if the Sessions Court decides to give death penalty, then it has to be sent to the High Court for confirmation. So the matter will be argued again before the High Court, and the High Court can then convert it into either life imprisonment or death penalty. Now any offence which has death penalty as one of the punishments, death penalty cannot be the only punishment. It has to be with some other punishment. So generally it is death or life imprisonment, and that is the judiciary the judge's discretion to decide what he grants, and death has to be granted only in the rarest of rare cases. So in this particular module, we have looked at the trial process, the witnesses, the evidence, and the punishments which are there in the criminal cases. With this, we end the criminal processes. Please read the e-text that has been given to you. Thank you very much.